Hey, before we start this video, I'd like to clarify that this is not a build guide. This video is really just meant to show my experience as a consumer who is trying to build a PC in 2020, with my only background knowledge really being the YouTube videos I've been binging during quarantine. What I really want to highlight in this video is the process of researching parts, finding places to buy them, and how it feels when you're putting a PC together with little to no help. If you want a proper build guide, I'd recommend watching the big tech YouTubers like Linus Tech Tips, Jay's 2 Cents, and Bitwit. These guys will definitely do a better job at explaining how to put a PC together than I ever could. So before I can get my hands on any parts, I'm obviously going to have to burn a hole in my wallet. Being the broke college student that I am, I have to spend what little of my college loans I have left, so I'm looking for the best price for performance. This is where things get very hazy. Wanting to really get a feel for the performance of all the hardware that's available, I watched as many budget build videos as I could from some of the aforementioned tech channels, which I will link in the description. To start off, it was very apparent that I had a choice to make between AMD's Ryzen or Intel's CPUs. Originally, I was much more inclined to go Intel since a lot of the high-end systems I've seen on YouTube use Intel chips, like the 9700K. But after some more research, I learned about the motherboard compatibility issues I could potentially face with Intel, and that added an additional layer of complexity that made it harder to find cheaper parts. On screen, you can see they have a whole site dedicated to CPU and motherboard compatibility, since Intel has gone through so many revisions in their sockets and chipsets. Being restricted to certain chipsets for an Intel CPU closed off opportunity for potential future upgrades. It made it hard to determine if the budget motherboards I was finding would even work with a CPU I wanted. This is what led me to Ryzen's offerings with the AM4 socket that seemed compatible with just about all the Ryzen CPUs, new and old, as long as I had a BIOS update for the newer CPUs. I felt a lot more comfortable buying a Ryzen board and CPU knowing that I would have the opportunity to upgrade either component rather painlessly, not having to worry about potential compatibility issues. After deciding to go Team Red, it was time to actually choose a CPU. This is where things got unbelievably pricey and confusing. Again, referencing the videos I watched, I discovered many CPUs that did a lot for a modest price, falling somewhere within a range of $85 to $130. Not that bad. Things were looking great until I actually clicked on these links to retailers to find that some of these CPUs had skyrocketed in price. For example, the Ryzen 5 1600AF was originally priced at $85, as seen in Bitwit's video here. Meanwhile, as of November 24th, 2020, it runs at a price of $189 on Amazon, which is basically double. A lot of CPUs seem to have this inflated price issue, which I can only presume is due to supply chain issues and or higher demands for computer goods due to COVID. This is what leads me to the CPU I did pick out, the Ryzen 5 3400G. The 3400G is an APU, meaning the CPU has integrated graphics, just like all the other Intel CPUs. The CPU currently runs for about $150, which is a bit pricier than what I was looking for, but it did cut the need for a graphics card. Now, I know a lot of you are probably screaming at me about needing a discrete GPU to do anything visually intensive, but I have several reasons for not buying a GPU as of right now. For one, this PC isn't necessarily gaming focused. It's a PC that's meant to do work and can potentially game, since it's going to my sister. Secondly, GPU prices, just like the CPU prices, look to be slightly inflated. The graphics card I would have paired with the system would have been a GTX 1650 Super, which on Newegg right now is running for about $200 plus. When I look for the MSRP of this graphics card, it's about $160, so a secondhand solution is probably the way to go. I'm currently looking through eBay, OfferUp, Craigslist, and what other secondhand site I can find to really try to find a good deal on a graphics card as of now. After picking out my CPU, I went straight to PCPARTPICKER. PCPARTPICKER is a website you can use to find compatible hardware for a build, and also get some estimates on price and wattage. It was super helpful in making sure that everything I planned on buying would work with each other. Although this tool is great, there can be some small details that fall through the cracks, like whether a motherboard is running a BIOS that can support your CPU. So make sure to do some research on your own to confirm everything you will buy does work together. For those who just want to do a quick spec check of this computer I have built, I'll have my PCPARTPICKER list here, and I'm going to run through each part quickly and explain why I chose them. So here's a quick breakdown of what I bought. For the motherboard, I went with the ASRock B450 MAC, since the B450 chipset is cheaper than the B550, and it was the cheapest board that had Wi-Fi that I could find. For the power supply, I got a good deal on a 650 watt Rosewell Hive that was thankfully fully modular, making it easier to cable manage when it came time to build. For RAM, I got a 2-stick 16GB set of 3600Hz memory from Silicon Power. In terms of storage, I went with a mixed approach, with a Team Group 512GB M.2 SSD for the boot drive and an additional 2TB Western Digital hard disk drive. Finally, to hold everything together, I went with a Dark Flash DLM21 mesh, since it had a neat glass door for the side panel and had amazing looking airflow with the mesh front panel. Since I hadn't had too much time with these parts just yet, I can't give you a proper holistic review, but I was able to post, and that's pretty good to me. One important thing I forgot to mention was buying a USB thumb drive to install Windows. You will need a thumb drive to boot the PC for the first time, so make sure to pick one up. I got a 16GB SanDisk one for about $6 on Amazon, so they're not all that expensive or hard to find. Just make sure you have a drive you can buy that has at least 8 gigs. For the rest of the video, I'm just going to play a sped up version of my Twitch stream where I built a PC, and I'm just going to talk over some of the major things about shopping for parts and what I encountered while putting this thing together. So when it came time to buy all the parts I did end up getting, searching for deals was a major contributor. With it being the holiday season and just before Black Friday, a lot of the components I was looking for were on sale, allowing me to stretch my budget just a bit further. So when you do go out and buy parts for yourself, make sure to check all the sales tabs on sites like Newegg to see if there are any flash sales for components you might need so you don't have to pay full price for them. When it came time to build, I started off with putting pieces into the motherboard. Putting in the CPU, M.2 drive, and RAM was pretty simple. It kind of felt like Legos with extra steps. I was very hesitant at first to put any force on the pieces, but the RAM in particular I should have been a lot more firm with to make sure it seated properly. You'll see later that I spent a whole lot of time trying to boot, but my system kept cycling because I didn't insert my RAM correctly. So you might have noticed earlier that we didn't add a CPU cooler to our PC part pickers list, and that's because we're using the stock cooler that came with the 3400G, the Ryzen Wraith Spire cooler. Due to the low wattage nature of the Ryzen CPUs, the stock cooler will do just fine in making sure that our CPU stays cool. Throughout the video, you're going to see me opening and closing manuals a lot. This is partially due to my reluctance to look up a build guide, but it also ensures all the steps I was taking were correct for the hardware I was using. These manuals were actually a lot more helpful than I thought they were going to be, but there were still many times where I had questions that could only be answered by turning to Google. So this is probably going to be a me-only issue, but I didn't know that the standoffs in the case for the motherboard don't actually go through the holes on the board. The motherboard is meant to literally stand on top of them so that there's a bit of a gap between the back of the board and the motherboard tray. So I ended up spending maybe an hour just trying to figure out why the board wasn't fitting, when in reality it was actually just fine to begin with. So this might be common knowledge, but I did spend a lot of time messing around with my hard disk drive mount because I didn't get the fact that you're meant to put the hard disk mount screws literally into the hard disk drive. That was kind of weird for me at first, and I spent a lot of time just trying to line up the holes on the hard disk drive with the mount. So when you get to that part, just know the screws do go into the hard disk drive. I didn't go over them earlier because I couldn't find them on PCPARTPICKER, but I did buy 3 adjustable RGB fans from Cooler Master. These fans are called the Cooler Master Sickle Flow 120V2 with addressable RGB and a square frame. So I had another issue with fans. I bought too many of them. I didn't consider the amount of fan headers my motherboard had when I bought the fans, and so I ended up buying 3 fans and installing them, but when it came time to hook them up, I had 3 fans but only 2 fan headers. So now I have this fan sitting in the bottom of the case doing nothing. So when you do end up buying fans, make sure you check the amount of fan headers you have. So with a fully modular power supply like this Roseville power supply, you will get a full set of cables along with the actual power supply unit itself. If I'm being completely honest right now, I still don't know what exactly each cord is meant to go to, but I can give you a general rundown of where some of the connectors are meant to go. The 20+4 pin connector goes to the side of the motherboard and provides power for all the headers. Then the 4+4 connector runs to the 8-pin header near the CPU to give it power. I don't have a graphics card in this system, but if I did, I would need to run the 6+2 PCIe connector to power it. Lastly, the SATA connectors will go to drives to power them. In my case, it was used to power my hard disk drive. There could be other potential uses for these connectors, but this is just what I know from experience/intuition. So this still might just be a me problem, but when it came time to installing the fans, mine had these Y connectors for RGB, meaning there was a male and female component to them, and I don't really understand what I'm meant to do with them. I heard the term daisy chaining a lot when I was trying to figure out what to do with it, but I wasn't still really sure how I was meant to connect them. This is why you don't see any lights in my case when I boot up the system, even though the fans are meant to have addressable RGB. The fans themselves work fine, but if someone could explain to me how the RGB portion of it is supposed to work in the comments, that would be great. Here you can see me trying to turn on the system over and over again like I mentioned before. I was having issues booting the system because my RAM wasn't seated properly, so I sort of had to go through this whole process of trying to troubleshoot the system by unplugging and plugging things in one piece at a time until I finally discovered that RAM was the issue. After plugging everything in, I still had some issues booting because of my RAM like I mentioned earlier, but after properly seating it, I got the system to boot to Windows, and I can't explain just how satisfying it was to finally get the screen to turn on. Here you can see me opening Task Manager in Windows just to make sure that my system knows what kind of CPU it has in it, the kind of RAM it has in it, the amount of RAM it has in it, as well as can detect both of my drives to make sure that all the components that I put in properly registering and working. After finally successfully booting the system and making sure everything was a-okay, it was time to cable manage and put everything together. I would like to point out that I got zip ties from both my power supply and my case, so when you do go out and make your own system, I don't think you'll need to buy your own zip ties. All in all, putting this thing together was a multi-week process with hefty amounts of research and deal searching before even touching any of the hardware, but it was really fun getting to learn the ins and outs of the market and specs of all levels of hardware. If you have the funds to do so, I recommend trying to build a PC yourself, just so you can have the experience with not just building, but also troubleshooting. Who knows, you might be able to save your aunt's PC in the future with this knowledge. Before I leave, here are some of the funnier parts of the stream that I wanted to share.
We're downloading more RAM. We're teaching the Minecraft kids how to download more RAM right now. I think that's what we're doing. Yeah, so yes, I'm a professional now, so. Let's put on the back panel, which I think goes on this way. Is it this way? Not gonna lie, I don't remember which way this came on. This is the part of the build where we say, just pretend like it's not there. That's alright. Aha!